When you're a rabbi, people send you all sorts of interesting things on email, and sometimes they drop off articles in my office, things that the congregation feels that would be of interest to me. I try and read everything that people send my way. I love the jokes that come through on email. Someone a few weeks ago sent me a really interesting article, knowing that I was a pet owner, about the challenges of pet ownership. And the subtext of the article was that pet ownership has a spiritual quality to it. And in the course of the article, the author described his canines as the dogs who have owned me. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? The dogs who have owned me. It struck me as both odd, but actually quite adept. A dog's owner is his master. He owns the dog doesn't own him. But if you think about pet ownership, I don't know if anybody here or online has a pet or has ever had a pet, whether it's a dog or a cat or a horse or even a goldfish, you know that pet ownership demands a great deal out of its master. Even last night, after I was finished with the Seder and totally exhausted, had to go out and walk the dog. I've had dogs all my life, and I do wonder sometimes who owns who. I have to make sure all his needs are taken care of, sometimes at great expense. Make sure he has exercise, make sure he has food, make sure he has water. Of course, I own him, but what pet ownership teaches you, among other things, is that whenever we own something, in some ways, we ourselves are owned. Home ownership is the same thing. Do you own the home, or does the home own you? In his book, Sapiens, Yuval Harari makes a very similar claim about the human connection to the wheat plant. He suggests that as a species, humans have not owned wheat as much as wheat has owned us. And humans have not domesticated wheat as much as wheat has domesticated us. It's a fascinating chapter in his book. Consider, he posits, the position of wheat thousands of years ago. It was, at that time, just one of many different wild grasses confined to a very small part of the Middle East. Actually, wheat originates in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. Within just a few short millennia, wheat started growing all over the world. According to the basic evolutionary criteria of survival and reproduction, wheat has become one of the most successful plants in the history of the world. Wheat is grown today on more land area than any other food crop, and world trade in wheat is greater than for all other crops combined. All from a very small wild grass in the Middle East. So what changed? How did this grass go from becoming quite insignificant to ubiquitous? Harari argues that wheat manipulated us. Up until wheat was adopted as a staple crop for human consumption, we lived quite comfortably as hunter-gatherers. But our symbiotic relationship with the wheat species changed everything. I quote from his book, Within a couple of millennia, humans in many parts of the world were doing little from dawn to dusk other than taking care of wheat plants. It wasn't easy. Wheat demanded a lot of them. Wheat didn't like rocks and pebbles, so sapiens broke their backs clearing fields. Wheat didn't like sharing its space, its water, or its nutrients with other plants, so men and women labored long days, weeding under the scorching sun. In other words, according to Harari, as much as we would like to think that we own our wheat consumption, the archaeological evidence shows that it's quite otherwise, that wheat owned us in some way. Its cultivation changed the human being, changed the way we lived forever. And I want to submit that I think this idea may be something we are called to reflect upon at Pesach. If you follow the story of how we ended up in Egypt in the first place and what we did once we got there, wheat plays a big part in the story. I'm not just talking about the obvious role of wheat on the evening of the Exodus. That's one day. But think of how our story originates, even in the last chapters of the book of Genesis. One of Joseph's dreams, you might recall, was a dream of wheat. Almost as if the Torah might be telling us that this whole story of slavery started with wheat. Who else had a dream about wheat? Pharaoh had a dream about wheat. And what was the solution to the dream? How did Joseph interpret it, which ended up making him viceroy of Egypt? Well, it was all about wheat. There would be years of famine followed by years of plenty. And even more so, how does Jacob's family end up down in Egypt at Joseph's feet? Well, there was a famine. There was no wheat in their part of the world, but there was wheat in Egypt. Egypt at that time was considered the bread basket of the world, their version of Saskatchewan. We know that actually much of our ancestors' servitude in Egypt had to do with that particular plant. We know it from the Torah, which talks about the straw that was used to make the bricks. Remember that part of the story? And how at one point Pharaoh says, you're going to make the bricks even without straw? Well, that straw was taken by our Israelite ancestors from the fields after the wheat was harvested. It's incredible, if you think about it, how much of that story the Torah seems to be jabbing at us to reflect on how it all happened because of this plant. And by the way, if I was to tell the story of how slavery began on these shores in the New World, its primary motivation was also agriculture. Not wheat as much, but cotton, sugar, tobacco, coffee. That's the story of slavery in the New World. So maybe eating this matzah is supposed to encourage us to think about the ways that these crops can end up owning us. When we left Egypt, We weren't just throwing off the yoke of Pharaoh's rule. We weren't just telling the Egyptians that we had had enough. We were also rejecting our relationship with this grass. This grass that was more responsible for domesticating us, that's what Harari says, than anything else in the world. We were saying our lives will not be owned and ruled over by a plant. And so every year, we take everything made from wheat and the other 4 major classic species of grain, and we get it out of our sight. It all has to leave our homes. For 7 days, for 8 days here in the diaspora, we make a declaration that wheat does not own us. And how do we do that? By taking control of our wheat consumption, by limiting it in a quite radical way. Now remember, Bechol Dor Vador, we have to think about what lesson this has for us in our day too, when most of us are not sowing wheat on the fields. But we have different ownership issues in 2021 too. They're different, but I would say just as significant and dangerous. Maybe it's not wheat, maybe it's not our pets, but there are things in our lives that make demands of us, and if we are not careful, they too can usurp our freedom. In the technological world that we live in, the prized commodity is not wheat, it's not even your money, it's your attention. When screens and devices and streaming devices get your attention, that's where the money is. That's what's churned into profits. It is no secret by now that all of these devices are designed to demand your servitude. No wonder every year the electronic devices that we carry occupy more and more of our time. That's exactly what they're designed to do. And in a year of pandemic, boy, have they taken over. So who owns who? Whose phone is that? Do you own your own attention? Are you the masters of your own mind? That is a question you might want to think about at your Passover Seders tonight. The question of what owns you, and what can we do perhaps to reverse that relationship? What kinds of economic forces in the world keep many people chained in systems that they can't break out of? And are we strengthening or weakening those systems by our choices and our behaviors? Not easy questions to consider. But if we understand this history of wheat and the role that it plays in our story, I think those are questions that belong at our Passover Seders more than I or you maybe have expected. Because I think the greatest wisdom of the Haggadah is that freedom is never a destination. Freedom is never an end point. We never arrive there. Freedom is something we have to think about. It's something we have to struggle with. It's something we have to work for. Bechol Dor Vador, in every generation. Chag Sameach.